This Ktaxon K170 guitar was built from a kit that I purchased from Amazon for $60. When I first built it, I built it pretty much straight out of the box with no real refinements. I hadn't done any fretwork or any body work or anything, and it did play fairly well. But since then, I have made some improvements to it to try to bring it more to a premium level guitar. And so I wanted to share with you over the next 15 minutes or so exactly what I did. So with that, let's get to it. Here's the guitar in its current state, built with all the parts straight out of the box. Both the neck and body are completely unfinished. For the finish work, I don't intend to do anything too elaborate, but the wood will need some sort of protection. The strings that came with it are also a lighter gauge than what I'm used to, so before making any adjustments, I'm going to change the strings to what I typically play with, GHS Boomer's 10s. Let me do that real quick. Like my previous video, I'm not going to show the process of changing strings, as I assume most of you are familiar with how to do that. So I just finished changing the strings, but having changed to a higher gauge, the tremolo now floats way too high. So I'm going to adjust the claw screws here to restore it to where I want it. Now the bridge floats at a pretty comfortable level, with the claw screw heads at about 3/8 inch from the wood. Also, it doesn't look like the additional tension from the heavier strings bowed the neck anymore. It's still wonderfully straight with the tiniest bit of relief, just the way I like it. This does suggest that the manufacturer is well aware that the neck is where the quality really counts. Now, as far as the range of the tremolo system, it is somewhat limited. I have the 6 screws that the system hinges on with about 2 millimeters of clearance above the metal so it doesn't hinder the rotation, but you can see and hear from this video what kind of range it has. I do like how it keeps its tune fairly well when using it. Bottom line is I don't use the tremolo much these days, so I'm not really too concerned about its limits. On that note though, if any of you are luthiers or otherwise experienced in adjusting these tremolo systems, maybe you can let me know in the comments exactly how far these screws should go. Okay, so now we need to address the action. Both with the stock strings or the Boomer 10s I just replaced them with, I was able to get the action down to about 1.5 millimeters on the high E at the 12th fret with a minimal amount of fret buzz. I'm a light picker, so I don't mind a bit of buzzing on the attack, so I shoot for about 1 millimeter at the 12th fret. A lot of this high action, though, is attributable not so much to the settings at the bridge, but to the shallow slots at the nut, as you can see here. The high E floats almost a millimeter above the first fret. I want to get that down to about 0.25 millimeters and 0.5 millimeters with the low E. This will also prevent a raise in pitch when you finger the notes on the lower frets. So let's go ahead and file those grooves down. Here I'm using Music Nomad's 6-piece diamond-coated nut file set. This one here is 0.01 inches, matching the gauge of the high E. I started slowly and gently cutting into the groove, keeping a slight angle so that the highest part of the groove faces the fingerboard. The set is a bit costly, about $100, but since I plan to build and maintain several kit guitars in the future, I think it will be a good investment. I just couldn't find any tools that could do a comparable job for a lower price. I also like the fact that the width of each file exactly matches the gauge of my strings. After a repetitive process of cutting away a little, measuring, then cutting away some more, I finally reached the depth of 0.25 millimeters I was looking for. Now I move on to the low E using the 0.046 file and going for a clearance of 0.5 millimeters at the first fret. So here we are at 0.5 millimeters. I essentially repeated this process for the rest of the strings, but interpolated the height of each groove by eye, rather than strictly measuring the height of each one, which would have been a pretty tedious process. In any case, here's the final result. And here is the action now at the 12th fret. If not at 1 millimeter, certainly very close. So adjusting the nut slot height does make a huge difference in the overall action. Now the 21st and 22nd frets do seem to be choking off slightly. I suspect for two reasons. One, I'm testing the limits of playability at this low action, and two, there is no fall away. So I'm going to sand down a little bit of fall away to take care of that using my 9-inch StewMac fret leveler. First, I check to make sure the neck is perfectly straight. I also raise the strings slightly with a plastic string jack to make it easier to slip the leveler under the strings. I also cover the pickups with blue tape to keep the metal filings from sticking to the magnets. Finally, in the area that I will be leveling, I mark the top of each fret with a blue Sharpie so I can easily monitor how much metal is removed. I admittedly am a bit of a novice at this, so I am struggling slightly to maneuver the leveler. I am being very careful, though, to ensure I don't push down too hard as I move the leveler back and forth, just letting the weight of the leveler do the work. I work my way up the space between each adjacent pair of strings until I reach the top. After a quick check, I'm happy to find that the choke-off is gone. There's still a slight bit of buzzing, but that really doesn't bother me when the action is this low. I can always go back and perfect this job down the road. The next step is to re-crown each fret that was sanded. Here I'm using Music Nomad's Safe Zone file, which actually allows me to be more aggressive with the filing than I'm showing here. This is because the top of the file is smooth and prevents over-filing. I'm just being a little more reserved here while I get used to working with the tool, which I only recently purchased earlier this year at the NAMM show. Again, I can always go back and perfect my technique down the road. Here I'm using Music Nomad's fret end dressing file to take off the sharp edges. Again, it is a nice safe tool to work with since each side adjacent to the diamond-coated abrasive side is smooth and won't cut into the fingerboard. Finally, I polish the fret with a little double zero-grade steel wool. I repeat this process of re-crowning, dressing, and polishing for each fret that was touched by the leveler, about every fret higher than the 10th. Of course, I didn't need to crown the frets that were untouched by the fall-away fret leveling, but the ends still needed a little dressing. Followed by a light rub with steel wool. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how the fretwork turned out, and that wraps up pretty much everything I want to do structurally with the guitar. All that's really left to do is the finish work on the wood. Now, for this step, I don't want to completely disassemble the guitar, but do so just enough to protect the areas that won't be getting any finish work. Ideally, this step should be done before even assembling the guitar, but at the time I wasn't sure if this kit would be worth the effort of doing that. So that is essentially why it ended up being the last step. So with that, let's get to it. So what I've decided to do was give the body a few coats of polyurethane, maybe just 3 to start with. And for the neck, I'm going to keep it bare, but condition and moisture protect it using a beeswax product I really like. You can see here I just removed some of the hardware and masked off other parts with blue tape. Since I'll be brushing instead of spraying, I don't need to worry about being too thorough with the masking. Here I'm going over the entire body with 220 grit sandpaper to smooth things down a bit. I could barely keep my hands steady in anticipation of how it's going to look as I apply the first coat of poly. The poly is oil-based, and I'm using a 1-inch brush, which seems to be the perfect width for a job like this. Narrow enough to get between these tight spots, but wide enough to cover larger areas fairly quickly. Even though the cleanup is a little more involved than water-based, oils to me have always been easier to work with, since they don't dry as fast. Also, I think it'll be more resistant to sweat from our hands and arms as we play, that sort of thing. Just a quick painting 101 tip. Brush across the grain if needed for coverage, but always try to end with a stroke along the grain. A few little touch-ups and I think we're good for the first coat. We'll just let this dry overnight. The next day, I prep the surface for another coat by smoothing down the first coat with 220 grit sandpaper. After using the duster can, I follow up with a lightly dampened cloth to pick up any residual dust. Of course, I want to make sure the surface is completely dry before applying the second coat. I do want to work fairly quick as I apply the varnish, as it tends to thicken slightly a few minutes after applying. In general, though, the strokes blend well together. So now we're going to let this dry overnight. I was pretty careful to keep the layering as even as possible, but to avoid any risk of drips or runs, I thought it best to orient the body horizontally while drying. After it dries, I'm going to repeat the process, sanding it down with 220 grit and applying a third coat. I'm not going to bother filming that step though, since it's essentially the same as how I applied the second coat. So here's the finished body after removing the masking and reattaching the hardware. I do love the way the poly makes the grain stand out and brings out the reddish hue. Admittedly, with brushing, it is difficult to get a mirror-perfect finish, but this to me is more than adequate. For the neck, as I mentioned earlier, I plan to apply a wax-based product. To prepare the surface for that, I go over the back of the neck with 400 grit sandpaper. Followed by a light smoothing over with the 00 grade steel wool. And then just a little steel wool on the fingerboard. So now comes the exciting part, watching the beauty of the wood come to life as I apply this Howard feed-in wax. To do this, I shake the bottle lightly, apply about a teaspoonful on a clean cloth, then gently start to rub the wax in. I do this repeatedly until the wood is generously covered by the wax and it has been well rubbed in. After letting the wax sit and soak for 20 minutes, I rub off the excess. I then apply another layer. After applying 3 layers with 20-minute rest intervals in between, you can see how the maple takes on a nice rich tone that complements the body, and we have a beautiful dark fingerboard. Okay, so here it is with the machine heads restored and a full set of GHS Boomers 10s on there. The body is still just a little bit tacky because the polyurethanes only had about less than a week to cure before doing all this. And it usually takes about 3 weeks for polyurethane to fully cure and harden. But it's still playable enough, so I am going to take it for a little test drive right now. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or concerns or any kind of feedback you want to provide. And definitely would appreciate a subscription if you enjoyed watching what I did. I hope it was informative to you. So with that, I just want to say thanks for watching and hope to see you in the next video.